Hi, my name is Isabel Carter. I've spent most of my 43 years with sawdust in my hair and salt in my lungs. Around here, that's not a complaint. It's a way of life. Our family's boatyard sits on a quiet stretch of Oregon's coast, tucked between a rocky bluff and the narrow harbor where the tide rolls in, slow, like it's in no hurry to get anywhere. My grandfather used to say the ocean had its own clock, and you'd better learn to keep time with it if you wanted to survive. I learned early. By the time I was 12, I could plane a cedar board smooth enough to catch sunlight, and I knew the smell of fresh varnish almost as well as I knew the sound of my own name. This yard was my classroom, my church, my anchor. Every Carter kid was expected to pitch in, but I stuck around long after the others found reasons to drift away. Glenn, my younger brother, always had an eye for bigger deals and bigger towns. Me? I stayed. So when I say I know this place, every creak in the dock, every knot in the planks, I mean it the way some people mean they know the lines on their own palm. That's why I noticed it, the thing that didn't fit, before I'd even killed the engine on my truck. It was just past 6 on a late September evening when I turned off the coastal highway. The sun hung low over the water, throwing a molten streak across the waves. The gulls had already settled on the pilings, riding out the last bit of warmth before night dropped in. And there it was, light spilling out of the boat shop's high windows, bright against the dimming sky. We don't turn the lights on early. Never have. Not when electricity rates jump every winter, not when the day's work is done before the sun's gone. Out here, you only flip that switch for 2 reasons: company coming or trouble brewing. My gut told me which one it was. I rolled down my window as I pulled into the gravel lot, breathing in the familiar mix of brine and cedar shavings. Normally, that smell steadies me. Not tonight. The crunch of tires on gravel sounded louder than it should, like the yard itself was holding its breath. Inside, the air was still warm from the day's work. The boat frames stood in their cradles, half-skinned in golden planks, the scent of linseed oil thick in the air. Everything looked the same, except it didn't. Halfway down the wall in the main office hung a blank patch of faded wood, rectangular and ghost pale compared to the rest. For 20 years, that spot held a black and white photograph from 1965, the day Carter and Sons Boatyard opened its doors. My grandparents stood front and center, flanked by my dad as a lanky teenager, my mom, before she learned to talk in careful edges, and me, a gap-toothed 10-year-old gripping a mallet almost too big for my hands. We were all grinning like fools under a hand-painted sign. That photo was gone. In its place hung a framed print of a generic seascape. Calm blue waters, perfect little sailboat in the distance. The kind of thing you'd find in a motel lobby, not here. I set my bag down slowly, the way you do when you don't want to make sudden moves in unfamiliar territory. My first thought was maybe Mom had taken it home to clean the frame. But when I checked the desk drawers, the file cabinet, even the shelf behind the shop radio, there was no sign of it. And here's the thing, that picture wasn't just a decoration. On the back, in my grandfather's blocky handwriting, he'd written, "This yard belongs to you, together. Take care of it." It wasn't a legal document, but in our family, it might as well have been carved in oak. That promise had been the one constant in a life where storms, real and otherwise, came without warning. Seeing it gone was like finding the anchor missing from a boat still tied at the dock. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to the muffled slap of water against the pilings. My mind went back to a day in my teens, sanding the hull of a skiff in the midday sun. My grandfather had paused beside me, resting one hand on the curve of the wood. "Isabel," he'd said, "a boat will treat you as well as you treat it. Same goes for a family. Don't let anyone tell you different." Back then, I'd thought he meant we'd always be in it together. Tonight, the empty space on that wall felt like someone had started rewriting the story without me. I locked up the shop and crossed the yard toward the house. The tide was going out, leaving the air damp and cool. In the kitchen, I set a kettle on the stove and tried to shake off the unease. But even the sound of water heating couldn't cover the low murmur of voices drifting from my father's study. The door was mostly closed, just enough of a gap for light to slip through. I knew that tone in my mother's voice, low, quick, and meant to stay inside the room. "If we close before the end of the month, we dodge the tax hike," she said. A deeper voice, not my father's, answered, "The buyer's ready. Just need the last signature." My hand tightened on the kettle handle. The floorboard under my foot gave a small, betraying creak, and the voices went still. A chair scraped. Then silence. I stepped back into the kitchen, poured the boiling water over a tea bag, and sat at the table as if I'd been there all along. A minute later, my parents came in. My mother smiled too brightly. My father asked if the ferry from Seattle had been crowded. We talked about the weather, the new seafood place down by the marina, everything except the boatyard. That night, lying in my old room upstairs, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint whine of the wind in the eaves. It had been years since I'd felt like a stranger in my own home, but tonight the walls felt like they were keeping secrets, and I had the sinking sense that whatever was going on wasn't just about business. It was about the promise on the back of that missing photograph, and the fact that someone, somewhere in my own family, had decided it no longer applied to me. The next morning, the fog rolled in thick from the harbor, wrapping the yard in a gray hush. I woke early, out of habit, and brewed a pot of coffee before heading down to the shop. The boards on the dock were slick under my boots, beads of mist clinging to the railings. Normally, this early, I'd find Glenn tinkering with an outboard motor or sweeping sawdust into neat piles. Instead, the shop was quiet. Too quiet. Halfway through pouring feed for the seagulls that had made our roof their unofficial nesting ground, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Glenn was cutting across the yard toward the storage shed, a stack of papers tucked under his arm. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, shoulders tight like he was walking into a headwind. "Morning," I called, aiming for casual. "Busy," he said without looking at me, adjusting the papers like they might blow away in the perfectly still air. I watched him disappear into the shed and shut the door behind him. The click of the lock was soft but unmistakable. That door hadn't been locked in years. Mom used to say you can tell more from what someone won't look at than from what they will. This morning, Glenn couldn't meet my eyes. By mid-morning, the fog had thinned enough for the outlines of the fishing boats to appear in the harbor. The shop still felt like it was holding its breath, so I decided to head into town. Main Street was waking up slow. The bakery's front door was propped open, letting the smell of fresh bread drift out into the street. Down at the corner, Hank was sweeping the sidewalk outside the hardware store, moving at the same pace he had for the last 20 years. I parked outside the chandlery, figuring I'd pick up a few supplies and maybe catch a whiff of whatever was floating through the gossip channels. In a town this size, news travels faster than the tide, if you know where to listen. Inside, the shelves were lined with coils of rope, brass fittings, and jars of boat varnish in every shade of amber. A few customers glanced my way, then busied themselves with inspecting fishing lures or pretending to read labels they'd probably memorized years ago. It was the kind of sudden shift you only notice when you've lived somewhere long enough to spot it. I'd become the subject of the unspoken. "Isabel," a warm voice said behind me. I turned to see Maggie Reed carrying a paper bag of deck screws and smelling faintly of cinnamon rolls from the bakery. Her smile was genuine, but there was a shadow in her eyes, like she knew something and wasn't sure if she should be the one to say it. We made small talk as we walked to the counter, swapping notes about the weather and the new crab season. But her tone carried that careful edge people use when they're circling around something bigger. "Got time for a coffee?" she asked as we stepped outside. We ended up at Dockside Diner, where the windows fogged up from the warmth inside and the smell of bacon mingled with the faint tang of salt air. Maggie slid into the booth across from me, waited for the waitress to pour our coffee, and then leaned in. "I thought you'd already know," she said softly. Everyone's been talking about the sale." I kept my face neutral. "Sale of what?" "The boatyard. Word is the deal's been in motion for a few weeks now. Some company from Portland, maybe bigger. They're talking about putting in a marina with a hotel. Folks have been speculating about what it'll mean for the harbor." Her words settled in my chest like a dropped anchor. The whole town had been trading pieces of my family's business over coffee and pie, while I was left in the dark. "When did you hear this?" I asked. "A couple weeks ago. Glenn was in here buying some supplies, talking to Mark about how the place would finally be put to better use." She shrugged, but her eyes stayed on me. "I figured you were part of it. It's your place, too." I stirred cream into my coffee slowly, watching the swirl dissolve. "Interesting?" I said, keeping my voice even. Inside, though, a knot was forming, tight, cold, and familiar. If they thought keeping me out of the loop would make me slower to act, they were in for a surprise. Maggie seemed to sense she'd said enough. We finished our coffee with lighter talk. New boats in the harbor, a storm coming in from the north. But every word I heard was layered over the sound of my grandfather's voice in my memory. In this business, the real dangers aren't always storms you can see coming. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the halyards on the sailboats moored nearby. Maggie squeezed my arm before heading down the sidewalk, leaving me with the din of gulls and the slow churn of the tide. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the morning settle, then walked back toward my truck. The drive home was quiet except for the hum of the tires on the wet road. In my mind, I lined up the pieces. The missing photograph from the shop wall. The overheard conversation in my father's study. Glenn's locked door and stack of papers. And now, confirmation from the town gossip chain. The picture was starting to come into focus. Back at the yard, I parked beside the old crab shack and spotted my mother near the slipway, talking to a man in a navy windbreaker. His shoes were spotless. City shoes, not the kind that had ever touched our dock's damp boards. When she saw me, Marion's smile was warm enough to pass for genuine. She waved me over. "This is my daughter, Isabel," she told the man brightly. "She helps tidy up around here when she has time." It was a neat sentence, delivered with precision, and it clipped my role down to something peripheral, like I was an occasional volunteer, not someone who'd kept the yard running more than once when the others were away. The man gave me a polite nod, but his attention was already drifting back to whatever deal they'd been discussing. I returned the nod, keeping my expression pleasant while filing the moment away in the ledger I'd started in my head, because I knew then what I hadn't wanted to admit last night. This wasn't just business. This was a rewrite of the family story, and they were planning to leave my chapter out entirely. 3 days later, the autumn festival was in full swing. Around here, it wasn't just a celebration. It was the 1 week a year. The whole town turned out, dressed in thick sweaters, strolling past stalls selling hot chowder in paper cups and apple cider that steamed in the cold air. For us, it was also prime time to show off our craft. Every year, since I was tall enough to hold a chisel, the Carter booth stood near the center of the harbor green. The same varnished table, the same row of scale models of boats we'd built, and usually my father or I explaining the details to curious visitors. That morning, I arrived early with a box of hand-carved tillers, the wood polished until it caught the pale sun, the smell of cedar mixed with cinnamon from the pastry stall 2 booths over. I was setting up when I noticed the sign hanging above our display. It didn't say Carter & Sons Boatyard like it always had. It said Carter Boatyard, managed by Glenn Carter. My name wasn't anywhere. I stood there a moment, the tiller in my hands suddenly heavier. I could hear my father's voice across the crowd, warm and confident, explaining to a tourist how my son runs the operations now, keeps the place running smooth. When I stepped closer, Glenn was already in conversation with a man in a wool cap, pointing to the largest model boat on the table. My father spotted me and smiled. Thin, polite, like you'd acknowledge a neighbor you barely knew. "This is my daughter, Isabel," he told the man. "She helps out now and then when she's in town." There it was again, that same careful diminishment, as if decades of labor could be summed up as the occasional errand. I forced a smile, nodding to the man, and set my box down at the end of the table. But when I tried to log into the shop's order system on my phone to check our current workload, the screen flashed. "Access denied." I tried again. Same message. "System's under maintenance," Glenn said quickly, not looking at me. "I'll let you know when it's back up." He didn't bother explaining why he could access it earlier, or why the maintenance seemed to coincide with me standing right there. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of polite conversations and the background noise of the festival. Children laughing near the carousel, the creak of the wooden dock as people strolled past. Every now and then, I caught snippets from townsfolk who didn't think I was listening. I heard it's all but sold. Glenn's making the right move. Can't keep an old boatyard alive forever. By noon, I'd had enough. I left the booth in Glenn's capable hands, as my father put it, and walked toward the far end of the harbor where the fishing boats were moored. The wind off the water bit through my sweater, sharper than I'd expected for late September. I found Tom there, the oldest hand at the yard. His beard was salt white, and his eyes had the kind of clarity you only get from years of reading tides. He was coiling rope on the deck of his skiff, moving with the patience of someone who doesn't waste motion. "Festival not your thing this year?" he asked, not looking up. "Not when I'm just the hired help," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. Tom glanced at me then, his brow furrowing. "They cut you out?" "Feels like it," I admitted. "No name on the booth, no access to the order files, can't even log in to check what jobs are coming in." He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "That's not oversight, Isabel, that's strategy." I leaned against the railing, watching the gulls dive at the surface. "They've been meeting with buyers. I overheard Mom talking taxes and closing dates. The town knows more than I do at this point." For a long moment, Tom didn't say anything. Then he straightened, wiped his hands on his worn jacket, and studied me like he was deciding something. "Come by the yard early tomorrow," he said finally, "before anyone else gets there. I've got something you should see." The next morning, I did exactly that. The sun was just a pale smear over the horizon, the air sharp with the scent of low tide. Tom was already there, waiting beside the side door to the storage building. He handed me a small, weathered key. "Your grandfather gave me this when he got sick. Said to keep it safe until you needed it. I think you need it now." Inside, the air was cool and faintly musty, the smell of old rope and tarred canvas. In the corner stood a cedar chest I'd seen 100 times but never opened. Tom set the key in my hand. The lock clicked open, and inside was a neat stack of papers, tied with a strip of oilcloth. The top sheet was a deed, faded ink, my grandfather's name in bold, and then mine. It was dated 15 years ago. I blinked, scanning the lines. The deed transferred ownership of the back warehouse, the one where we stored the best lumber, and the small dock attached to it, directly to me. "It's yours, Isabel," Tom said quietly. "Always has been. He wanted you to have the heart of the yard, no matter what happened." The papers also included a clause that any sale involving that section required my signature. Without it, no buyer could claim the property. I felt a strange mix of relief and fury. Relief that I wasn't powerless. Fury that my own family had tried to keep this from me. "Why didn't they tell me?" I asked. Tom's mouth tightened. "Maybe because they knew you wouldn't just sign it away." I closed the chest and locked it again, slipping the key into my pocket. The air outside felt different now, crisper, sharper, charged with something I hadn't felt in weeks, resolve. They might have stripped my name from the booth and locked me out of the system, but they'd underestimated me, and they'd forgotten something my grandfather taught me a long time ago. You can't take the wind out of a sailor's sails if she's already steering into it. The next 24 hours felt like I was walking around with a live wire in my pocket. Every time I thought about that deed, my pulse kicked up a notch. It wasn't just paper. It was a lever. And if I used it right, I could shift the entire balance of power in the yard. I spent that night at my small apartment above the marina instead of going back to the family house. Less chance of awkward questions, more room to think. I laid the deed out on my kitchen table, reading it over until the words felt burned into my mind. The clause was crystal clear. Any transfer, lease, or sale of the property described herein shall require the written consent of Isabel Carter. No loopholes, no wiggle room. Tom stopped by just after sunrise with a thermos of coffee and 2 pastries from the bakery. "You're going to need energy," he said, sliding into the chair opposite me. "What's the plan?" "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "But I know one thing. They're not selling my piece without going through me, and I'm not going to make it easy." Tom smiled faintly. "That's the Isabel I remember." We talked through options, lawyers, public records, even going to the press. But I wasn't ready to go nuclear, not yet. There was a meeting scheduled that afternoon at the town's community hall. Glenn had mentioned it in passing last week, calling it an investor presentation. My guess? It was the moment they planned to lock in the deal. The hall smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table draped in a white cloth, behind which sat my parents, Glenn, and a man I didn't recognize, probably the investor. Around the room, a few townsfolk lingered, curious enough to see what progress might mean for the harbor. I slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. My mother was mid-sentence, talking about modernizing the waterfront and new opportunities for tourism. Glenn followed with a polished pitch about the inevitable decline of traditional boat building and how the sale would secure the Carter legacy in a sustainable way. When the investor began outlining the resort plans, new marina slips, a boutique hotel, curated retail experiences, I felt the knot in my chest harden. It wasn't just a sale, it was an erasure. I waited until Glenn clicked to the final slide of his presentation before I stood. "Interesting plan," I said, my voice carrying enough to turn heads. "But there's one problem: you can't sell what you don't own." The room went still. My mother's smile froze. I walked down the aisle, each step deliberate, the deed in my hand. I laid it on the table between Glenn and the investor. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "is the deed to the back warehouse and the dock you're including in your sale. It's been mine for 15 years. Courtesy of Grandpa. Without my signature, your deal doesn't go through." The investor frowned, leaning over to read. Glenn's face drained of color. My father's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to make a scene," I continued, "but if you want my cooperation, you'll need to meet my terms. A public acknowledgement of my role in the yard, a fair share of the profits, and assurances that the heritage of this place won't be paved over for a parking lot." A murmur rippled through the room. Some faces looked shocked, others pleased. People who'd grown up around here knew what that yard meant. My father leaned toward the microphone. "We can discuss this privately, Isabel." "No," I said. "We're discussing it now, in front of the people who've supported us all these years." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Finally, the investor straightened, clearly calculating his next move. If what she says is accurate, we'll need to renegotiate the terms. My mother's eyes flashed, but she kept her tone smooth. "We'll take a short recess." Outside, the air was crisp, the scent of the bay sharp in my nose. Glenn followed me out, his steps quick. "You didn't have to do that," he hissed. "Yes, I did," I said, "because you were willing to sign away something that isn't yours." He shoved his hands into his pockets. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Hard?" I said, stepping closer. "You've been trying to erase me from my own life's work. I'm not just going to stand by and watch." He looked away, jaw working, but didn't reply. Back inside, the meeting dragged on in low voices and terse expressions. By the end, no deal was signed. The investor left with a polite nod, promising to review the updated conditions. My parents packed up their papers in tight silence. As I walked out, Tom caught my arm. "You just bought yourself some time," he said quietly. "Use it." And I intended to, because now I knew exactly where the fault lines were, and I wasn't afraid to start digging. The next morning, the boatyard was too quiet for comfort. No clatter of tools, no thump of lumber being moved, no hum of the table saw, just the hollow echo of gulls circling above, calling into the damp air. I knew why. My family had retreated behind closed doors to regroup, and I was at the center of the storm. I found them in the main office. My father was at his desk, leaning forward, elbows braced like he was trying to hold the world in place. My mother stood by the window, arms folded, gaze fixed on the harbor as though she might find an easier version of her life somewhere out there. Glenn was pacing, his hands opening and closing, like he wanted to throw something but couldn't decide what. "You blindsided us," Glenn said before I'd even stepped all the way inside. "No," I said calmly. "I reminded you that this isn't just your decision to make." Dad's voice was quiet, but the edge was there. "You could have handled it privately." I met his eyes. "You could have included me from the beginning." That landed heavier than I expected. He looked away first. Mom turned from the window. "This yard is drowning, Isabel." "You think holding on to a piece of paper is going to change the math? Selling is the smart move." "What's smart," I said, "is not handing over 100 years of family work to people who see it as nothing more than real estate. What's smart is keeping the part of this place that makes it worth anything. Its history, its craftsmanship, the trust we've built here." Glenn snorted. "You can't stop change." "No," I said, "but I can make sure change doesn't erase us." For a moment, the only sound was the faint slap of water against the pilings outside. Then Dad leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "What exactly do you want?" he asked. I had thought about that all night. "I want my rightful role back. Full access to the accounts, the client list, and decision-making. I want a halt on any sale discussions until we've explored other options for keeping the yard profitable. And if we can't agree, I'll consider leasing my section to a competitor or starting my own operation right next door." That last part got their attention. "You'd do that?" Glenn asked, eyes narrowing. "If you leave me no choice," I said. The meeting ended with no resolution, just a strained promise to talk again soon. But I knew stalling was their game now, hoping I'd back down. They didn't know I'd already started lining up my next move. That afternoon, I called a few old clients, people I trusted, people who remembered when Carter & Sons was more than just a business name. I told them the truth. I had control of the back dock and warehouse, and I was considering independent commissions. The response was stronger than I expected. By the third call, I already had offers to discuss projects off the books. I didn't agree to anything yet, but the seed was planted. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Tom stopped by with a folder. Inside were copies of past contracts, invoices, and maintenance logs, records I hadn't been able to access since they'd locked me out. "I pulled these before they changed the system," he said. "Might come in handy." I flipped through them, my jaw tightening at the numbers. There were expenses here that didn't add up, consulting fees to companies I'd never heard of, equipment purchases we didn't need. "They've been bleeding money," I said quietly. Tom nodded. "And if you can prove mismanagement, you'll have more leverage than just that deed." The next day, I asked Glenn to meet me at the dock. The tide was halfway out, the air smelling of kelp and diesel. I held the folder in my hands. "You've been making decisions without me," I said, "and now I know why. These expenses, want to explain them?" His jaw clenched. "You don't understand." "No, Glenn," I cut in. "I understand perfectly. You've been running this place into the ground so a sale looks like the only option, and you're not going to get away with it." He tried to grab the folder, but I stepped back. "Make no mistake," I said, my voice low. "If you keep pushing me out, I'll take this to every client, every paper, and every investor in town, and I'll still have my dock and warehouse to work from when the dust settles." For a long second, we just stared at each other. Then he turned on his heel and walked away, muttering under his breath. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since I'd come back, I felt like I was steering my own course again. The next week, I stayed quiet on the surface. No more arguments in the office, no more public interruptions, just the appearance of stepping back while I worked harder than ever behind the scenes. It was a trick I'd learned from my grandfather. Sometimes you tack with the wind to make people think you're drifting, when you're actually setting up your next move. I spent my mornings in the back warehouse, restoring a half-finished skiff I'd been working on before all this started. The rhythmic rasp of the plane against the cedar, the smell of fresh shavings. These things kept me steady while I planned. In the afternoons, I met with people quietly, old clients, local fishermen, a lawyer I trusted from Portland. I laid out my situation in careful detail, my legal ownership of the warehouse and dock, the evidence of questionable expenses, and my plan to protect the yard's heritage. Every single one of them told me the same thing. You have the upper hand. Use it. By Friday, the plan was ready. I called for a stakeholders meeting in the community hall, same place they'd tried to finalize the sale without me. This time, I invited more than just the investors. I invited the Harbor Commission, the Historical Society, and key townsfolk who cared about preserving our working waterfront. When the day came, the hall was full. My parents and Glenn arrived together, clearly expecting to control the narrative. They didn't realize I'd already shifted the tide. I stood at the front, a large roll of paper beside me. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "You've probably heard talk of selling the Carter boatyard. But before any decisions are made, I think it's time you heard the full story." I unrolled the first document, the deed, to a ripple of murmurs. "This warehouse and dock have been mine for 15 years. No sale can happen without my consent." Then I laid out copies of the expense records on the table for anyone to see. In the last year alone, tens of thousands of dollars have been spent on unnecessary equipment and vague consulting fees. I believe these decisions were made to weaken the yard's finances and justify selling. The investor shifted in his seat. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Glenn stared at the floor. I let the silence hang a moment before moving to the final part. "I'm not here to stop progress. I'm here to make sure progress doesn't destroy what makes this place worth anything. So here's my offer. I'll agree to partner with any investor who commits in writing to keeping the boat building operations intact, hiring local workers, and preserving the historical character of the yard. In return, I'll contribute my section of the property and oversee operations." I glanced around the room. "If that's not agreeable, I'll lease my dock and warehouse independently, take my client list, and run my own business right next door. And I'll share every detail of these records with the local press." It was a gamble, but I could feel the shift in the room. The Harbor Commission members were nodding. A few fishermen in the back clapped quietly. Even the investor looked thoughtful now because he could see the math. Partnering with me was the faster, cleaner route than fighting me. Finally, he spoke. "If you're willing to formalize those terms, Miss Carter, I'm willing to renegotiate." Glenn shot him a sharp look, but my father leaned back, exhaling slowly. "It seems we don't have much choice," he said. I smiled just enough to be polite. "You always have a choice. I'm just making sure mine counts, too." The rest of the meeting was a blur of drafting agreements and outlining next steps. By the end, we had a preliminary plan, joint ownership, heritage preservation clauses, and my role reinstated as operations manager. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was enough to protect the heart of the yard and to remind everyone I wasn't a piece they could quietly remove from the board. That evening, I walked the dock as the sun went down, the tide pushing gently against the pilings. Tom joined me, hands in his jacket pockets. "You played it well," he said. "Grandpa always said the last move should be the one they don't see coming," I replied. He grinned. "Looks like you learned from the best." I looked back at the warehouse, its windows glowing in the twilight. My name wasn't on a sign yet, but it was written where it mattered, in the work, in the history, in the part of this place that would still be standing long after the investors moved on. And for the first time in months, I felt like the tide was with me again. The deal was signed 2 weeks later in the small conference room at the harbor office. No fanfare, no photographers, just a few sheets of paper, a fountain pen that had been in my grandfather's desk for decades, and the quiet scratch of signatures sealing a new chapter for the yard. When it was my turn to sign, I felt the weight of everything that had happened press into my hand. Months of tension, sleepless nights, the sting of betrayal, the relief of finding my footing again, and underneath it all, the stubborn pride of knowing I hadn't just stood by while they dismantled the life I'd helped build. The new agreement wasn't perfect. It rarely is when you're dealing with family and business in the same breath. My parents still held the largest share. Glenn still had a say in decisions, but now so did I. On paper, in the bank records, in the actual day-to-day operations. The heritage clause was in black and white. No development could alter the historic structures, no work outsourced overseas, and at least 70% of the crew had to be local hires. The investor, perhaps sensing the PR gold in preserving a piece of maritime history, agreed without much resistance. For the first time in months, the horizon didn't feel like a threat. I threw myself back into the work. The first week, I met with every single crew member individually, listening to their concerns, asking what they needed most. Some wanted better safety equipment. Others just wanted assurance their jobs weren't on the chopping block. Tom's request was simple. "Let me keep teaching the apprentices the old way, even if it's slower." I promised him he could. We reopened the books to new commissions, not just restoration work, but custom builds. A retired teacher from Boston ordered a small fishing boat. A young couple from New York wanted a hand-built sailboat for their honeymoon. The energy shifted fast. It felt like breathing fresh salt air after weeks in a closed room. But the biggest change wasn't in the yard. It was in me. I'd always thought of myself as part of this place, but I'd never fully claimed it as mine. I deferred to my father, to my mother's cautious advice, even to Glenn when he spoke with confidence. This fight had forced me to step out from behind the workbench and plant my feet where everyone could see them, and once I did, I realized I liked the view. One evening in late October, after the last of the crew had gone home, I stayed behind in the warehouse. The skiff I'd been restoring was finally finished. The varnish gleamed under the low lights, and the cedar smelled faintly sweet. I ran my hand along the gunnel, feeling the smooth curve beneath my palm. My grandfather had started this one before his health declined. He never got to see it complete. I wished he could now. "You'd have liked this one," I murmured, imagining him standing beside me, hands in his pockets, that quiet nod he gave when he approved of something. Later, I walked out to the dock. The harbor was calm, the water a sheet of rippled gold in the fading light. Behind me, the warehouse windows glowed warm, a beacon against the dark. Tom's voice came from behind. "She's a beauty, that skiff." "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Feels like closing a circle." He leaned on the railing. "So, what's next for you, Isabel?" I thought about it. For once, I wasn't thinking in terms of what I had to do to survive. I was thinking about what I wanted to build. I think we make this place stronger than it's been in years, and maybe, one day, hand it off to someone who loves it enough to fight for it too. A week later, the sign above the booth at the Autumn Festival was changed. It no longer read Carter Boatyard, managed by Glenn Carter. It read Carter Boatyard, established 1923, Isabel Carter, operations manager. It was a small thing, just words on a board. But standing there, watching townsfolk stop to read it, some smiling, some nodding in approval, it meant more than I could say. I didn't need applause. I didn't need anyone to call me a hero. I just needed to know that when people walked past this booth next year, and the year after that, they'd see proof that history didn't have to be erased to move forward. Some wounds in the family would take time to heal. There were still unspoken resentments, still dinners where the conversation skirted too close to dangerous ground. But we were learning to work side by side again, cautiously maybe, but with a shared understanding that the yard mattered more than any one of us alone. And that, I realized, was the quiet victory. As I locked up the warehouse one last time that night, I paused to look back at the yard. The masts stood against the darkening sky like watchmen, steady and unyielding. The smell of the bay rolled in on the breeze. Somewhere out on the water, a bell buoy clanged softly. I took a deep breath. The fight was over. But the work, the real work, was just beginning. Sometimes, protecting what matters most isn't about winning every battle. It's about standing your ground when it counts. I didn't just save a dock or a warehouse. I saved the heartbeat of a place and the promise that it will outlast me. If you're facing your own fight, remember, you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need the courage to stay. Because love, real love, always leaves a mark. Thank you for watching. If this story spoke to your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. And always remember, you matter, and your love leaves a mark.